The house was plunged into a tense silence when the dry sound echoed through the room. "Be quiet, Rick," her stepfather shouted. His voice cut through the air like a blade, and even the walls seemed to tremble. Emily, only 9 years old, felt her body shrink and her eyes water, but she didn't dare make a sound. Outside, the wind swayed the trees, as if even nature had stopped to listen. Her heart pounded so loudly it seemed to fill the space. The kitchen clock read just after 6 o'clock. It was the weekend, and her mother, Linda, was in her bedroom trying to calm a persistent headache. Emily knew she should be doing her math homework, but she couldn't concentrate. Rick's gaze weighed on her like lead. Each second that passed felt like an eternity, as if the room had become an invisible prison. And it's at this point that I want to ask you something very special. If you're following this story and feel like it's already touched you, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. That way you won't miss a single detail of what will happen to Emily and her grandfather. I promise that every minute of this journey will touch your heart and bring you profound lessons. As few stories can, suddenly an unexpected sound broke the weight of the silence. A blue rotating beacon flashed in the window, painting the room with flashes of cold light. Rick froze. Emily, not quite understanding, widened her eyes. The sound of firm footsteps echoed in the hallway, and soon after, the front door was opened. With determination, it was as if an angel had crossed that threshold. There stood Mr. Johnson, Emily's grandfather. Broad shoulders, neatly combed white hair, and a steady gaze that conveyed both calm and authority. Beside him stood 2 uniformed police officers. Emily's heart leaped, relief mixed with disbelief. Rick, who just seconds ago had seemed to dominate the room, had now lost all his strength. His world was about to be turned upside down. Grandfather didn't say anything right away. He simply walked over to Emily and placed his hand on her shoulder. A simple gesture, but one filled with love and protection. Emily felt tears stream down her face, but this time they were tears of hope. Rick opened his mouth to try to speak, but his voice faltered. The entire room seemed suspended, as if everyone were waiting for the next scene. Sergeant Miller, a middle-aged man with a deep voice and firm posture, stepped forward. He looked directly at Rick and said, "We need to talk." Tension laced the air, but there was also a breath of justice coming through the door. Emily looked at her grandfather as if he were a movie hero. What no one knew was that this wasn't the first time Mr. Johnson had faced giants in his life. The clock continued to tick away, but now time seemed to move at a different pace. Emily felt her chest warm as she stood beside her grandfather. Rick, his face hard, tried to maintain a pose of authority, but his hands trembled slightly. It was a small detail, but enough to reveal his vulnerability. The living room table with its checkered tablecloth looked like the stage for a drama that was just beginning. The sergeant asked everyone to sit down, but Rick hesitated. It was Mr. Johnson who looked him in the eye and, in a firm voice, said, "You'd better cooperate." There was no anger in the words, but there was weight. Rick reluctantly pulled out his chair and sat down. Emily stood beside her grandfather, feeling finally protected, even though she didn't understand everything that was happening. Linda, her mother, heard the noise and appeared in the hallway. Her face was pale, her eyes were tired, and her expression was a mixture of surprise and fear. When she saw her father there, along with the police, she put her hand to her chest. It wasn't just relief, it was also shame. Her silence for so long was now before witnesses, and that weighed more heavily than any words. Mr. Johnson never took his eyes off Rick. His presence filled the room with a strength that came not from youth, but from experience. Emily remembered when he'd tell her Bible stories before bed about David facing Goliath. And suddenly, she realized this was the same moment. Only now, Goliath wasn't an armored giant, but an ordinary man who used fear as a weapon. The sergeant opened a folder and began asking questions. Emily took in every detail, from the pen scratching on the paper to the sound of Rick's heavy breathing. The room seemed smaller, more cramped, but inside, something different was happening. The truth was about to emerge from the shadows. Emily couldn't take her eyes off her grandfather, as if his strength were the only thread holding her together. Rick tried to justify his actions, saying he was just trying to maintain discipline, but his voice sounded weak and lacking conviction. The sergeant showed no emotion, just continued taking notes. Linda lowered her head, as if she could no longer keep up the act. Emily looked at everyone, trying to understand how adults could be so different from one another. Some brought fear, others brought light. The wind continued to blow against the window, reminding her that outside the world was normal. But inside that house, nothing would ever be the same. Emily felt it in every fiber of her being. Mr. Johnson, even in silence, seemed to be telling her, "You are not alone." That was the phrase her heart needed to hear most. And what no one knew was that there was still much more hidden in that story. Rick began to lose his temper, his voice rising, trying to regain control. But the officers shifted slightly, as if to say without words that the line had already been crossed. Emily squeezed her grandfather's hand. The room, once a place of fear, now became the scene of an awakening, and every second seemed to open a new door to the unexpected. Rick leaned back in his chair, trying to appear in control, but the sweat on his forehead betrayed him. With each question Sergeant Miller asked, his voice wavered a little more. Emily, watching, realized her stepfather wasn't as strong as he seemed. That mask of authority was crumbling before her eyes. It was like watching a sandcastle being washed away by the tide. Mr. Johnson, on the other hand, remained remarkably calm. He didn't need to raise his voice. His silence said it all. Emily remembered summer afternoons in her grandfather's backyard, when he would teach her to whistle or ride a bike. It was that same man standing there now, but bigger than ever. Her heart filled with new confidence. Her mother, Linda, stood leaning against the door. Her eyes were red, but not with anger. They were the eyes of someone carrying too much weight. And finally seeing a breath, she wanted to speak, but her throat felt tight. Emily noticed this, and for a moment she felt sorry for her own mother. She knew that, somehow, she too was trapped in painful silences. The sergeant paused, looked up from his notebook and stared at Rick. "Do you understand the gravity of what's happening here?" he asked. The stepfather took a deep breath but didn't answer. The silence was filled with the sound of the wind at the window. Mr. Johnson, his hand still on his granddaughter's shoulder, simply watched. As if knowing that the truth always finds its way, Emily looked at her grandfather and thought of the verse he'd repeated so often. "The truth will set you free." She didn't fully understand what it meant, but in that moment, it seemed to make sense. The fear that had paralyzed her was slowly dissolving. It was as if someone had lit a small candle in a dark room, and that flame, though fragile, illuminated everything. Rick finally muttered a few words, trying to justify his shouting as strict upbringing, but the officer's expression showed no one there believed him. Linda let out a sob, covering her face with her hand. Emily shrank into her grandfather's embrace. The scene was harsh, but within her a seed of hope was already blossoming. Something was about to change forever. The house phone rang, breaking the heavy atmosphere. Linda ran to answer it, but returned quickly, pale. It was Emily's teacher, Mrs. Carter, worried about not seeing her at school the last few days. The sergeant took note, and Rick looked away. Emily felt her stomach churn, but she also realized someone out there was watching over her. Even without her asking, grandfather cleared his throat and for the first time spoke directly to Rick. "You may fool some, but you can't fool your conscience." His voice was firm without the need for shouting. Emily's eyes widened, feeling proud of her grandfather. Rick bowed his head for a moment, and that gesture spoke volumes. It was the beginning of an inevitable downfall. Sergeant Miller asked Emily to go to her room to get some of her belongings. She hesitated, but her grandfather nodded with an encouraging look. When she entered the room, her heart raced. She grabbed her backpack. The notebook was scribbled verses and the doll her grandmother had given her. Each object was a piece of her story. But what no one knew was that this simple gesture would carry enormous weight. As Emily stood in her room, she heard her stepfather's voice rising again, but it was soon drowned out by the sergeant's firmness. She took a deep breath, hugging the doll to her chest. She felt her life changing, even if she didn't yet understand how. That house, which had so often trapped her in silence, now seemed to be draining of its power. Fear was losing ground. Returning to the living room, Emily found her grandfather standing, waiting for her. His small smile was the spark she needed. Rick remained seated, but his hardened expression no longer frightened her as before. The officers exchanged quick glances as if they already had a plan in place. Emily took a deep breath, thinking maybe, just maybe, I'll be able to sleep peacefully tonight. Linda finally approached Emily and tried to touch her hand. The girl hesitated, but let her? It was a brief touch, but it carried weight. Her mother's gaze said everything words couldn't: apology, pain, and an overwhelming desire to start over. Emily wasn't sure she could trust her yet, but in that moment, she didn't want to push that hand away. Her grandfather watched in silence. Rick stood up suddenly, as if trying to regain control of the situation, but the sergeant restrained him. With a firm gesture, "Sit down," he said, his tone unchanged. Rick obeyed, but his gaze was filled with fury. Emily cowered again until her grandfather stood in front of her like a human shield. And that was how she realized true love fears no confrontation. Time seemed to slow down. Emily looked at each face, memorizing the details. Her grandfather strong and serene, her mother confused, but breaking the silence, the police officers attentive, recording every step, and Rick growing smaller before everyone. That scene, would be etched in her memory forever, not as a nightmare, but as the beginning of something new. The sergeant closed the folder, took a deep breath, and said, "That's enough for today." Emily's heart skipped a beat. Her grandfather put his arm around her and simply said, "Let's go home." But the girl knew the word home would never mean the same again, and the big surprise was that the real story was just beginning. In that small town of Springfield, Ohio, life seemed ordinary to those passing by. Rows of houses, well-kept lawns, and children playing on their bikes. But behind one of these doors, Emily's routine was quite different. Small signs, almost invisible to those who didn't look closely, began to tell a story of pain. It was a heavy silence, difficult to explain. Rick, her stepfather, had a presence that filled the entire house. It wasn't just his size, but the way he looked. Emily felt her every move was being watched. She didn't need words to understand when something was bothering him. Just the way he dropped his keys on the table or the sudden silence during dinner was enough to make everyone tense. Her mother, Linda, was trying to balance her job at the local supermarket with the pressures at home. She arrived tired, often in uniform, and still had to deal with the tense atmosphere. Some days she seemed to want to say something, but gave up before she could even begin. Emily sensed this and harbored the same desire for silence. It was as if everyone learned to walk on tiptoe. At school, Emily seemed sweet, but distracted. Her teacher, Mrs. Carter, noticed her staring out the window. There were days when Emily forgot her supplies, others when she arrived without a snack. Nothing blatant, but subtle signs that, to the attentive eye, sounded like a cry for help. And Mrs. Carter began to notice that something wasn't right. Little by little, the girl drifted away from her friends. Before, she would play on the playground, laugh with her classmates, and exchange stickers, but now she preferred to be alone, drawing trees and little houses. Her notebook was full of doodles that seemed innocent but revealed so much. Closed doors, locked windows, faceless people. No one in the class understood. But for Emily, those drawings were a way to express herself. Rick, in public, knew how to smile. He greeted neighbors, made jokes at the barber on the corner, and even helped carry groceries into the house. He seemed like the ideal stepfather. But within the walls of the living room, the mask slipped. All it took was a low grade from Emily, or a broken dish for his expression to change. It wasn't always shouting. Sometimes it was just a silence that weighed more heavily than any words. The neighbor, Mr. Thompson, even commented to Linda that Emily seemed more withdrawn. She just smiled and said it was just her age. But deep down, Linda knew it wasn't just that. She could feel Rick's eyes on her, measuring every gesture. The fear wasn't overt. It was subtle, like a shadow that never went away. And the worst part was, no one on the outside could sense it. Emily was trying to find comfort in the little things. She liked to sit on the porch in the late afternoon and watch the sunset. She held tightly to the doll her grandmother had given her, like a silent guardian. Sometimes she repeated to herself a verse she had heard in Bible school, "Suffer the little children to come to me." She didn't understand everything, but she felt a God watching over her, even in silence. However, the tension inside the house was growing. Emily noticed her mother crying more often in the shower. She was trying to hide it, but her puffy eyes at breakfast gave it away. She didn't know if she should ask, so she remained quiet. This pact of silence kept the house together, but it also suffocated. It was like living inside a bubble where the air grew ever thinner. Sundays at church were the only times Emily felt light. She loved singing the hymns, even though she didn't understand every word. She loved the woody smell of the old pews and the sound of the organ filling the space. There, she felt like she could breathe. But when she returned home, the heaviness immediately returned. It was as if the front door were also a wall. Mrs. Carter, the teacher, began jotting down observations in a journal. Little things she noticed. Emily's lack of smile, the way she jumped at loud noises. She had no proof, but she had a strong feeling. She decided she needed to talk to the school counselor. It was a small step, but one that would begin to pave the way to the truth. What no one knew was that it would have enormous consequences. At home, Rick was increasingly controlling. He decided the schedules, the conversations, even how the table should be set. Emily felt she had no room to be a child. Even her laughter was controlled. If she laughed too loudly, a disapproving look would soon follow. This constant vigilance shaped her behavior like an invisible cage, and her heart learned to beat slower. Linda tried to make up for it with small gestures. She made heart-shaped pancakes for breakfast and hid sweet notes in Emily's lunchbox. But these moments were quickly swallowed up by the tense atmosphere in the house. Emily kept these details close to her heart, like little treasures. She knew her mother loved her, even if she was afraid to act differently. This conflict only deepened her confusion. The days passed, and the girl began to dream of her grandfather. In the dreams, Mr. Johnson appeared as a guardian, dispelling her fear. It was a fond memory of the times she had spent vacations at his house, fishing on the lake in Dayton. These dreams gave her strength to face the daily grind. Emily would wake up wanting to call him, but she knew she couldn't. Rick didn't like visitors, much less unexpected calls. One afternoon, on her way home from school, Emily overheard two neighbors talking. They were commenting that Linda seemed more tired lately, more haggard. Emily pretended not to hear, but felt her face flush. It was strange to hear about her own family like that, but at the same time, there was a secret relief. In realizing someone else noticed the difference, the bubble wasn't entirely invisible. Rick became increasingly irritated by small things. The loud sound of the television, a misplaced glass, even the way Emily walked around the room. Nothing seemed to please him. The girl learned to become almost invisible, always silent, always careful. But even then, it was never enough. Fear became part of the routine, as if permeated by the air, and Emily no longer knew what it was like to live without him. One night, Linda tried to talk to Rick about seeking help, maybe even family therapy. He responded with a harsh laugh, as if it were absurd. Emily heard the argument from the stairs, hidden, and felt her heart race. Her stepfather's words were full of contempt. In that moment, she understood that her mother was trapped too. She wasn't the only one living in silence. Mrs. Carter finally sought out the school counselor, Ms. Green. She reported her observations, still cautiously but firmly. Ms. Green listened carefully, taking note of every detail. She decided she needed to act even without all the evidence. It was a risk, but ignoring it could be even worse. And it was this silent decision that began to set bigger wheels in motion. Meanwhile, Emily clung even tighter to the faith she'd learned from her grandfather. She kept a small New Testament in her backpack, a gift from Grandma Martha. She read verses at random, as if searching for hidden answers. She didn't understand everything, but she felt peace. It was as if those words were a rope thrown into a deep well, and she held on tight, hoping for a rescue she couldn't yet see. At dinner, Rick became more authoritative. He decided who spoke, who remained silent, and even how the food should be served. Emily learned to chew slowly, so as not to make noise. Linda lowered her eyes, avoiding eye contact. The table, which should have been a place of togetherness, became a stage for fear. But amidst all this, Emily began to learn something essential: to observe every detail. The girl's notebook was filled with drawings of open doors. She couldn't explain it, but she always felt the urge to draw passages leading outside. Some were colored, others just simple lines. When the teacher asked why, Emily just shrugged. But deep down, she knew it was a reflection of her feelings. She wanted to get out, but she didn't know how. What no one knew was that this exit was already on its way. Linda had tender moments, especially at night. She would sit beside her daughter, in bed, stroke her hair, and sing softly. Emily pretended to sleep, but treasured every second like gold. These were moments that gave her strength to carry on. Deep down, the girl knew her mother wasn't an enemy. She was just as trapped as she was, and this understanding made her even more empathetic. Rick began to object to church visits. He said there was no need to go every Sunday. Linda tried to argue, but eventually gave in. Emily missed the choir, the Bible stories, and the embrace of the older women in the congregation. It was as if they were taking away her last breath. But deep down, he continued to hum the hymns he remembered. Her heart wouldn't forget. At school, Ms. Green called Emily for a quiet chat. She asked how she was doing, her tone soft and welcoming. Emily didn't answer much, but her look spoke volumes. The counselor noticed her tension, her hesitation. She decided not to press, but made it clear she was there to help. She planted a seed that sooner or later would bear fruit. Rick, increasingly suspicious, began keeping an eye on even Emily's notebooks. She hid her New Testament deep in her backpack as if it were a forbidden treasure. She read it in secret before bed in the dim light of the lamp. The words cradled her like an invisible blanket. She didn't know that soon this book would become an important part of her courage. Linda felt torn. On one side, fear of Rick. On the other, love for her daughter. She dreamed of changing, but didn't know how. She felt weak, incapable. But deep down, a flame burned, however small. And that flame would grow bigger than she could have imagined. Emily, even without realizing it, was the spark that kept her mother alive. The weeks passed, and the signs of wear and tear only grew. Emily grew more tired, more withdrawn, but also more alert. She learned to read the house's atmosphere like someone reading the sky. She could predict storms. She knew when to hide. This painful skill was also what kept her going, and without meaning to, she was preparing for the big change at school. Ms. Green decided to officially register her concerns. She filled out reports, gathered observations from the teacher, and began a more serious process. It was a silent but crucial step. Emily knew nothing of it. She continued living her routine of silence and fear. But, invisibly, a safety net began to form around her. Rick, in his arrogance, was oblivious to the watchful eyes around him. He believed he controlled everything and everyone. But small details were already slipping through his fingers. Emily, even in silence, found refuge in dreams, drawings, and faith. Linda, even broken, still sought the strength to carry on, and outside people were moving. History was about to change course. Emily had a habit of hiding in the corner of her room before bed. It wasn't just fear, it was also a moment of silent surrender. With a small school notebook, she pasted verses her grandmother had given her onto colored paper. She couldn't explain it, but those words seemed to embrace her. It was her secret, her hidden strength. At night, while Rick slept, Emily would close her eyes and murmur short prayers. They weren't long nor complicated. They were simple, like "God, protect me," or "Lord, stay with me." Those whispers, barely audible, were her way of surviving, and, even without realizing it, her faith kept her going when everything around her seemed to be falling apart. Her mother, Linda, would sometimes come into Emily's room in the middle of the night. She said nothing, just sat on the edge of the bed. Her moist eyes revealed more than words could. Emily pretended to sleep, but she felt the weight of that silence. It was as if mother and daughter shared a secret pain, a bond of silence that spoke louder than any conversation. Aunt Sandra, Linda's sister, rarely visited. She lived in Columbus and worked 2 jobs, but whenever she showed up, she brought joy. Emily loved hearing her stories of her youth, her trips to the mall, and her afternoons with popcorn at the movies. Rick, however, never enjoyed her visit. He would frown and make excuses to leave, and Emily could tell that behind her aunt's smile, there was also concern. School was another place where watchful eyes began to take notice. Mrs. Carter, with her decades of experience, wasn't fooled by forced smiles. She watched the way Emily shrank in her chair, the way she avoided eye contact when called upon. She decided to discreetly speak with Ms. Green, the counselor. They needed to join forces even without concrete proof yet. At church, the pastor spoke about caring for the vulnerable. Emily listened attentively but didn't look up. She felt those words were meant for her, but she was afraid to believe them. The ladies in the congregation smiled at her, offered her sweets, and asked about school. Emily answered with few words but held each gesture of affection in her heart. They were signs that there was still goodness in the world. Grandfather, Mr. Johnson, even from a distance, never stopped calling. He called Linda, asking about Emily, wanting to know about school, about her friends, but often the calls were short. Rick didn't like long conversations, and Linda would end them quickly. Emily would listen, eager for one more word. But even so, those calls were like small windows open in the darkness at school. Ms. Green decided to create small moments with Emily. She would call her to help organize books in the library or just to chat about drawings. Emily didn't say much, but her expressions spoke louder than words. The counselor knew she needed patience. The heart of a traumatized child doesn't open all at once. But gradually, like a flower in cold weather, the neighbors were also beginning to notice signs. Mrs. Parker, who lived next door, told Linda that Emily was quieter than before. Linda smiled, trying to hide it, but inside she felt a pang. Emily, hidden behind the door, overheard part of the conversation, and that little observation from her neighbor brought her a mixture of shame and hope. At least someone was seeing something. Emily's prayers became more frequent. They weren't long prayers, but short, almost childlike conversations. She believed God heard her even without beautiful words. Sometimes she remembered biblical stories her grandfather had told her. Daniel in the lion's den, Joseph in Egypt, David against Goliath, and she thought, if they could do it, maybe I can too. This silent hope sustained her. Linda, meanwhile, lived in a constant dilemma. She wanted to protect her daughter, but she was afraid of Rick. She knew something was wrong, but couldn't find the strength to face it. Sometimes she found herself staring at Emily as she slept. Feeling guilty and helpless, she prayed quietly, asking God for forgiveness. And in those prayers she also asked for the courage to change. She didn't yet know how, but she wanted to. Aunt Sandra, on one of her rare visits, noticed something different. Emily avoided playing, always seemed alert. When Rick approached, the girl's behavior changed immediately. Sandra didn't comment at the time, but it stuck in her mind. She knew something was wrong, and she promised herself she'd be more vigilant. What no one knew was that this promise would carry weight in the future. At school, Emily took refuge in the library. She liked to stay among the books, smelling the old pages. She read adventure stories, stories of children overcoming challenges. Those characters became her secret friends. It was there that she felt least afraid. And, without realizing it, she fed the imagination that would one day give her the courage to face her own reality. Rick, in his arrogance, didn't realize he was being watched. He believed no one suspected anything, but the truth is, watchful. Eyes were already connecting the dots. Teachers, neighbors, family, everyone noticed something amiss. He underestimated the power of the collective gaze. And, as they say in church, nothing stays hidden forever. Emily kept a small box of memories. From when she lived closer to her grandfather, inside were old photos, little notes, and a ribbon from her grandmother's hair. These simple objects were like lucky charms. Whenever she felt afraid, she would open the box and look at them. It was a way to remember who she truly was. Even in the silence, there were roots that sustained her. One afternoon, Mrs. Green invited Emily to draw whatever she wanted. The girl drew a house with open doors and a road leading to a yellow sun. She said nothing, just handed him the paper. The counselor understood the message. It was Emily's way of asking for help without using words. She kept the drawing carefully, knowing it said much more than it seemed. A classmate's mother commented to Linda that Emily seemed too shy. "Has she always been like this?" she asked. Linda avoided the question, but it kept echoing in her mind. That night, she couldn't sleep. She realized she couldn't fool everyone forever. Eventually, the truth would come out, and maybe that was exactly what she needed. Rick even began to control Emily's friendships. He didn't like it when she was invited to play at her friends' houses. He always made excuses to stop her. Emily pretended not to care, but she missed the laughter in other people's backyards. It was as if he were slowly erasing her childhood. But inside her, a flame still burned. In this environment, Emily developed an impressive sensitivity. She learned to read expressions, tones of voice, and gestures. She knew when it was time to be silent, when it was safe to smile. This skill, born of pain, would also be her strength in the future. She didn't know it yet, but she was being trained to resist. Silence shaped her, but it didn't destroy her. Linda began keeping an open Bible in the living room. She didn't say anything, but left it there as a symbol. Rick didn't mind as long as no one talked too much about religion. Emily silently stared at those open pages. It was like a constant reminder that there was a greater hope. That Bible was more than a book. It was a discreet sign of resistance, attentive. Gazes multiplied. The teacher, the counselor, Aunt Sandra, even the neighbor. Each, in their own way, perceived fragments of the truth. It was like a puzzle beginning to come together. Emily, even without knowing it, was no longer as alone as she thought. And this silent network was about to change her life. One night, Emily dreamed of her grandfather arriving at her house. In the dream, he walked through the door with firm steps and embraced her. She woke with tears in her eyes, but also with a feeling of relief, as if God were telling her, help is on the way. And, in a way, that dream was a harbinger of what was to come. Emily's faith was small, but sincere. She didn't understand doctrines. She didn't know prayers by heart. But she knew God heard her. This certainty kept her going when fear overwhelmed her. It was a faith made of tears, of scribbles in a notebook, of short prayers. And, as the Bible says, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, Aunt Sandra's gaze grew ever more attentive. She noticed Linda's expression, Emily's silence, the tension in the air. He decided he wouldn't be so distant anymore. He considered calling more often, making surprise appearances. He didn't yet have the courage to confront her directly, but he was preparing himself. Her heart burned with indignation. At school, Emily wrote an essay about my favorite place. While her classmates talked about parks and travel, she wrote about her grandfather's house. She described the smell of fresh coffee, the porch swing, and walks on the lake. Mrs. Carter read it silently and felt a pang in her heart. It was a longing mixed with a silent plea. She kept the essay, knowing it was important. Rick continued to believe everything was under control, but what he couldn't see were the watchful eyes around him. His every gesture, his every silence, was already being watched. Emily, Linda, and even neighbors became unwitting witnesses. What was hidden was beginning to reveal itself, and when the light enters, the darkness loses its power. Emily grew increasingly attached to biblical stories. She especially loved the one about Joseph, sold by his brothers, but who later became a leader in Egypt, she thought. If he went through so much and prevailed, maybe I can too. This hope gave her a strength that surprised even herself. It was a small flame, but it withstood any wind. One night, Linda wrote a letter she never had the courage to deliver. A letter to her father, Mr. Johnson. She said she missed him, that she was tired, that she didn't know what to do. She put the letter in a drawer, crying silently. But that writing was a first step. Her heart was preparing to seek help. Emily observed everything with eagle eyes. She learned to remember details, to memorize gestures. She was a child, but she had the sensitivity of someone who had seen too much. This watchful eye would be her weapon in the future. And, even without realizing it, she was already becoming stronger. What no one knew was that the moment to use this strength was very close. Mr. Johnson was always a man of few words but firm gestures. He worked from an early age at the auto parts factory in Dayton, where his calloused hands told stories of hard work. He was respected by his colleagues, not only for his physical strength but also for his integrity. He never took shortcuts. He always believed that character was more important than any wealth. This was the foundation he carried through life in his younger years. He served in Vietnam. He didn't talk much about the war, but he bore scars that weren't limited to his body. He had memories he'd rather bury, but he also learned values he never forgot. Loyalty, discipline, courage. These traits shaped his personality. He used to say, "A man's worth is what he does when no one's looking." Emily loved hearing that. Her grandfather's house was simple but full of life. The smell of fresh coffee in the morning, the porch with its wooden swing, and old country music records playing on the radio. Emily had spent summers there running around the yard and fishing in the lake. These were memories that became treasures. Within her, this place represented freedom, unlike the suffocating house where she lived with Rick. Grandma Martha had passed away a few years ago, but her spirit was still present. She was known for her kind smile and her apple pies, which everyone raved about. Emily remembered the afternoons Martha taught her how to sew small cloths. Mr. Johnson cherished these memories, like someone holding onto a piece of light, and he made a point of keeping the family traditions alive. Her grandfather carried the promise he had made on the day of his wife's funeral. He looked at Emily, then a small child, and said, "As long as I draw breath, you will be safe." These words were etched in the girl's heart. They weren't just a phrase, they were a pact. Mr. Johnson saw in Emily the continuation of what Martha valued most: love, faith, and family. In the neighborhood, Mr. Johnson was known as a dependable man. He helped neighbors mow lawns, mend fences, or give rides to church. He always had a word of encouragement, always a firm hand. He didn't seek recognition, he simply believed it was his duty, and, in a way, this caring spirit extended to his granddaughter as well. He couldn't bear the thought of seeing her in danger. Deep down, Mr. Johnson distrusted Rick from the start. He disliked his manner, his cold gaze, and his harsh words. He tried to warn Linda a few times, but she always replied that everything was fine. Even so, the grandfather remained alert, waiting for the right moment to act. He didn't want to invade his daughter's life, but he knew he had to be ready. He was like a soldier on guard. Emily loved listening to her grandfather's stories about his childhood. In Ohio, he'd talk about walking through the cornfields to school, about helping his father in the workshop. They were simple stories, but they captivated her. She felt connected to a deeper root, to a story bigger than the problems at home, and that gave her a sense of belonging. At church, Mr. Johnson was respected as a man of faith. He wasn't one to raise his voice, but his presence was constant. He helped with the choir, organized community events, and was always the first to arrive and the last to leave. For Emily, seeing her grandfather at church was like seeing an unshakable rock. Even when the world seemed to be crumbling, he remained steadfast. This inspired her. Grandpa believed deeply in biblical principles. For him, protecting the weak was more than an obligation, it was a calling. He often quoted Proverbs, "Defend the rights of the poor and needy." Emily listened attentively, even though she didn't understand everything, but she was certain she was under the care of someone who truly lived it. This gave her confidence. Her grandfather's hands were living marks of his history, thick, calloused, covered in small cuts, but when they rested on Emily's shoulder, they conveyed a unique tenderness. It was as if all his strength had transformed into affection for her. Emily felt safe just being near him. It was a contrast that struck her. Hardness toward the world, gentleness toward those he loved. In the summer, her grandfather liked to take Emily to Riverscape Park in Dayton. They'd walk together, eat vanilla ice cream, and feed the ducks on the lake. For her, these moments were a slice of paradise. She felt like she could breathe, laugh, and truly be a child. And her grandfather always reassured her, "No matter what happens, there will always be a safe place for you here." Mr. Johnson also had a prayer routine. Every day before bed, he would kneel beside his bed. Emily, when she spent a few days with him, would observe in silence. It wasn't a quick prayer. It was an intimate conversation with God. He asked for protection for his family, strength to face challenges, and wisdom to guide his steps. Emily learned that faith was more than words. It was a daily discipline. The relationship between grandfather and granddaughter was marked by small gestures. He taught her to whistle, to roast marshmallows in the backyard, to tend the garden. Every detail was a life lesson. Emily realized that these weren't just activities, but hidden lessons. Her grandfather imparted values with every gesture, with every laugh. and this strengthened her more than he could have imagined. Despite his strong appearance, Mr. Johnson also had moments of fragility. Sometimes he would look at Martha's empty chair and sigh deeply. Emily would notice and hug her grandfather, trying to fill that void. He would smile gratefully, but his eyes would reveal longing. Still, he never let the pain paralyze him. He transformed his longing into strength to protect those he loved. Emily remembered when her grandfather taught her to ride a bike. She fell several times, scraped her knees, and cried. But he never let her give up. He always said, "Get up, try again, that's life." Those words echoed in her mind to this day. They were lessons that extended far beyond the backyard. They were teachings that would sustain her through the hardest days. Mr. Johnson had a presence that commanded respect. It wasn't his tone of voice, but his posture. He walked upright, looked people in the eye, and spoke clearly. Emily admired this and tried to imitate him, even at such a young age. She knew she wanted to grow up like him. Her grandfather was her living example of courage and dignity. Neighbors saw him as a trustworthy man, someone they could turn to without hesitation. They often knocked on his door to borrow tools or ask for advice on repairs. He never said no. He always said, "If I can help, it's because God gave me this chance." Emily felt a surge of pride upon hearing this. It was as if her grandfather was a beacon for everyone, not just her. The promise he'd made to Martha grew stronger every day. He knew he had to protect Emily at all costs. He felt in his heart that his granddaughter was facing more than she was letting on, and this troubled him. Love wouldn't let him rest in peace. With every brief call with Linda, his instincts screamed something was wrong. Emily kept every letter her grandfather sent her. They were filled with simple yet powerful words. He spoke of faith, hope, and courage. He told her he believed in her, that she was stronger than he thought. These letters were hidden treasures in the drawer. On difficult days, Emily reread each line and felt her heart warm. Mr. Johnson believed that protecting Emily was not just a responsibility, but a life mission. He saw in her the continuation of the family, the legacy Martha had left, and he knew he could not fail. The weight of this mission didn't frighten him. On the contrary, it strengthened him. It was like carrying a flag that could not fall. Her grandfather's faith was a safe haven. He often said that life was full of storms, but there was always a lighthouse to guide. Emily didn't fully understand, but she felt her grandfather was. That lighthouse, when she was with him, the darkness seemed less threatening. It was as if she could see beyond the fear. In the backyard stood an oak tree planted by Mr. Johnson when he was young. He called it a symbol of resilience. Emily loved playing in its shade, imagining that she, too, was as strong as her. Her grandfather used the tree as an example. Deep roots can weather any storm. These words became a secret motto for the girl. Mr. Johnson kept a box of warm mementos in his room. Medals, old photos, yellowed letters. Curious, Emily once asked him about them. He replied, "These mementos remind me of what I've faced and what I've survived." The girl realized that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the facing of it. That lesson never left her. The promise he'd made at Martha's funeral was becoming increasingly real. Mr. Johnson knew he needed to act soon. Something in his heart told him Emily was in danger. It was an instinct, a restlessness that wouldn't leave him alone. He began to silently prepare, and, like a seasoned soldier, he waited for the right moment to step in. Emily, for her part, dreamed of summers at her grandfather's house. She wanted to be back there running around the yard, eating apple pie. These dreams were her source of hope. She knew her grandfather would never leave her helpless, and deep down she believed that one day he would come to rescue her. What no one knew was that that day was closer than anyone imagined. It was an ordinary afternoon in Springfield, but Emily felt something different in the air. The sun was warmer than usual, and the wind carried a strange restlessness. She was sitting in the living room, trying to do her homework, when she heard the door slam shut. Rick had arrived and her heart raced. Every time he entered, the atmosphere changed. Linda, the mother, tried to remain calm. She prepared dinner, feigning normalcy, but her hands trembled as she chopped vegetables. Emily watched silently, already trained to notice every detail. The sound of keys falling to the table was the usual signal. Rick was in a bad mood. It was at these moments that tension mounted, and any word could turn into an explosion. The phone rang suddenly, and Linda rushed to answer it. It was Ms. Green, the school counselor, asking to talk about Emily. Linda answered quickly, trying to hide it, but Rick noticed. His gaze grew heavy, suspicious. Emily, even without hearing everything, understood that this call was important. Something bigger was moving. Rick didn't like it when the school got involved. For him, everything should be handled at home under his rules. Emily could hear his voice rising, but Linda, with rare courage, didn't tune him out. She continued the conversation to the end, even under his furious glare. It was a small gesture, but meaningful. Emily sensed that maybe, just maybe, her mother was starting to react. In the midst of all this, Rick overlooked one detail. The neighbor, Mrs. Parker, had heard part of the argument through the open window. She frowned uneasily. She'd suspected it before, but now she was certain something was wrong. She picked up the phone and made a discreet call. This quiet action would prove decisive. Emily didn't know it, but someone was fighting for her across the street. The clock struck 6:30 when the headlights of a police car illuminated the street. Emily looked out the window and saw the flashing lights painting everything blue. Her heart raced, unsure if it was fear or relief. Rick, noticing, walked firmly to the door. Linda held her breath, expecting the worst, and suddenly, a loud knock echoed. Police. Emily froze. It was as if time had stopped. Rick swung open the door arrogantly, trying to appear confident, but his face paled when he saw who was there. It wasn't just the police officers. Mr. Johnson, her grandfather, was standing beside them. Emily's heart leaped into her throat. The impossible was happening before her eyes. Sergeant Miller was blunt. "We've received reports. We need to talk now." Rick tried to argue, but his voice was shaky. Emily, hidden behind her mother, stared at her grandfather. He said nothing at first. He simply walked over to his granddaughter and pulled her close. His embrace was proof that she was no longer alone. Linda, tears in her eyes, didn't know how to react. Part of her felt exposed, embarrassed, but another part felt relieved. Finally, someone had broken the cycle of silence. Emily snuggled into her grandfather's embrace, feeling protected as never before. It was as if a wall had risen between her and Rick. For the first time, there was hope within that house. Rick, desperate, began to raise his voice. He claimed it was just a misunderstanding, that everything was being exaggerated. But the officers remained calm, writing down every word. The sergeant asked Emily to go to her room and bring some of her belongings. She hesitated, but her grandfather nodded with a firm look. It was time to move, even without understanding everything. As she climbed the stairs, Emily felt her legs tremble. Each step felt heavy, but also liberating. She grabbed her backpack, her notebook of verses, and her grandmother's doll. She clutched them to her chest and took a deep breath. It was as if she were saying goodbye to a chapter in her life. But, deep down, she knew a new one was about to begin. In the living room, Rick was still trying to maintain control, but his voice was growing hollow. Sergeant Miller urged calm, while another officer positioned himself near the door. Mr. Johnson stood firm, his granddaughter at his side. Linda shrank silently in her chair. Emily realized this moment wasn't just about her. It was also about her mother finally seeing. Tension mounted as Rick tried to stop Emily from leaving. He took a step forward, but the sergeant grabbed his arm. It was a quick gesture, but full of meaning. For the first time, Rick wasn't in control of the situation. Emily saw her stepfather shrink before the authority. It was a shock. The man who had seemed invincible now seemed small. Mr. Johnson then spoke, his voice calm but firm. Enough. He didn't need to say anything else. Rick backed away, not daring to face that gaze. Emily felt proud of her grandfather. It was like seeing a real-life hero before her. The weight of fear began to dissolve. But inside her, one question still lingered. What will happen now? The sergeant decided Emily would spend the night at her grandfather's house. Rick protested, but it was no use. The decision was made. Linda remained silent, tears streaming down her face. Emily held her grandfather's hand tightly, as if it were her lifeline. Her heart was beating fast, but a flame of hope was burning. This night would be unlike any other. As they walked out of the house, Emily looked back. The living room, the sofa, the table, everything seemed small, empty. That house would never be the same for her again. Rick was shouting things that no longer mattered. The police had him under control. Emily took a deep breath and took the first step toward freedom. She didn't know what was coming, but she knew she was safe. In the police car, her grandfather carefully settled her. Emily leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling finally protected. The lights flickered outside, illuminating the neighborhood streets. She wondered if people were looking out their windows. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. But deep down, it didn't matter. What mattered was that someone had taken courage. For her, the walk to her grandfather's house was silent. Emily watched the streets whiz by. The closed shops, the streetlights. She felt as if she were entering another world. Her grandfather caressed her hand silently. No words were needed. That gesture said it all. "You are with me now." Emily closed her eyes and took a deep breath. For the first time in a long time, she felt peace. Linda didn't go with them that night. She said she needed to sort out some things, but her look spoke louder than words. Emily realized her mother was still trapped, not by physical chains but by invisible fears. The girl's heart ached, but she also understood liberation doesn't always happen all at once. Sometimes it happens step by step. Arriving at her grandfather's house, Emily was greeted by the smell of fresh coffee and the porch swing. It was like returning to a forgotten place that had always been inside her. Grandpa prepared a plate of simple pancakes, and she ate them as if they were the best meal in the world. It wasn't just food, it was a welcome, it was a hug served in the form of dinner. That night, Emily slept in the room that had been hers for summers past. The blankets were soft, the lamp was on, and the window was open to the starry sky. She hugged her doll in her notebook, feeling safe. Her grandfather came in, kissed her forehead, and said, "You're home now." Emily closed her eyes with tears, but also with a smile. She felt something new begin. While Emily slept, Mr. Johnson lay awake, reflecting. He knew this was only the first battle. Rick wouldn't give up so easily, and Linda still needed help. But he also knew he wasn't alone. There was the police, the school, the community, and above all, there was faith. He looked at the open Bible on the table and said a silent prayer, "Lord, guide our steps." The next morning, Emily woke to the smell of pancakes and bacon. The kitchen was bright with sunlight, and her grandfather smiled as he poured coffee. It was as if she had entered another life, but deep down, she knew there was still a way to go. Fear doesn't disappear overnight, but now, there was a safety net around her. While they were having coffee, the phone rang. It was the school, confirming that Ms. Green had opened an official report. Her grandfather listened attentively, thanked her, and wrote everything down. Emily watched, trying to understand. She felt like the adult world was finally on her side. It was a strange but comforting feeling, and, without realizing it, she began to believe the worst was behind her. Rick, on the other hand, was already planning his apology. In his mind, it was all a misunderstanding, and he could still turn it around. He didn't realize the truth was already out. The mask was slipping. Emily didn't know the details, but she felt in her heart that something big was coming. It was like being in the face of a storm, but with a safe haven. Her grandfather promised himself he wouldn't leave Emily alone for even a second. He would be present at every meeting, every decision, every step. For him, it wasn't just about protecting her, but also about teaching her. He wanted his granddaughter to grow up knowing she was loved, respected, and strong. Hearing these words, Emily felt something blossom within her. It was the beginning of a new confidence. That day marked the end of one cycle and the beginning of another. Emily couldn't explain it, but she felt different, lighter, more hopeful. Her grandfather, with his firm presence, showed her that the future could be better. But deep down, she also knew the fight wasn't over yet. There were hidden truths that needed to come to light, and that would be the next step. The next morning, her grandfather's phone rang nonstop. Calls came from the school, from Counselor Ms. Green, and even from concerned neighbors. The news was already quietly beginning to circulate in the community. Mr. Johnson answered each call calmly, jotting everything down in a notebook. Emily watched silently, trying to grasp the weight of these conversations. Ms. Green was the first to officially introduce herself. She arrived at her grandfather's house with a folder full of reports. She sat at the kitchen table and explained the situation. Emily, with attentive eyes, listened to every word, even though she didn't fully understand. The counselor spoke firmly. "Now you're not alone anymore." These words echoed like music to the girl. Sergeant Miller also paid a visit. He wanted to record statements, listen to Emily, and understand the situation in detail. Mr. Johnson stayed by his granddaughter's side, the entire time ensuring she felt safe. Emily hesitated at first, but found courage. She spoke little, but she spoke the truth, and each word was like a stone being rolled away from a wall. Linda was also called to testify. "I was nervous, but I knew it was necessary." For the first time, he admitted there was fear in the house. He didn't use grandiose words, just the naked truth. She said she felt trapped, that she feared Rick, and that she didn't know how to protect Emily. It was a painful but liberating step. Tears flowed, but the current was beginning to break. Meanwhile, Mrs. Carter handed out her notes, small records of behavior, glances, tardiness, and absences. Nothing seemed significant in isolation, but together they formed a clear picture. Emily was surprised to know someone was watching her so closely. She felt seen, acknowledged. It was as if, finally, her pain had been validated. Investigators found messages on Linda's cell phone showing tense discussions with Rick, harsh words, intimidation, veiled threats. Every detail reinforced what Emily and Linda had already told them. The truth was beginning to take shape, piece by piece. Rick had no idea his mask was slipping so quickly, and Emily watched it all with wide eyes. Mr. Johnson, steadfast, attended every meeting. He didn't let anything go unnoticed. He asked questions, requested copies of documents, and wrote everything down in his notebook. Emily looked to him like a true shield. It was as if she were learning for the first time the meaning of the word justice, and this gave her a confidence she had never felt before. Rick tried to manipulate the situation, claiming it was all a fabrication. He tried to paint Linda as weak and Emily as overly sensitive. But the facts were against him, each statement, each piece of evidence dismantled. His words, Emily realized the truth had a power of its own. It didn't need to be shouted at, it just needed to be revealed. And that gave her more hope. At the local courthouse, a judge ordered Rick to be temporarily removed. It was an initial victory, but a significant one. Emily, upon hearing this, felt a weight lift from her. Linda wept with relief, and Mr. Johnson squeezed his granddaughter's hand. It was the beginning of a new phase. But everyone knew there was still a long way to go. The community began to mobilize. Neighbors offered help with meals, rides to school, even new clothes for Emily. The church organized prayers for the family. Emily was surprised by every gesture. People she barely knew were now standing beside her. The silence was being broken. On all sides, the truth could no longer be hidden. Emily, still shy, began to talk more. She shared details of her routine, little things she'd previously kept to herself. She discovered that putting things into words was liberating. Ms. Green always listened patiently, unhurriedly, and with each conversation the girl felt lighter. It was as if she were removing stones from a heavy backpack she'd been carrying. For years, Linda, though frightened, found strength in her own vulnerability. She realized that admitting the truth didn't make her weak, but brave. Emily looked at her with new eyes. She saw her mother as someone who also struggled, even in silence. This recognition brought a new bond between them. For the first time, they felt they were on the same side. The official report was finalized. Based on testimony and evidence, Rick would face formal charges. Word spread quickly, some were shocked, others said they already suspected. Emily heard the comments, but she no longer cared. The important thing was that the truth was finally out in the open, and that made her breathe deeply. Seeing Emily smile again, her grandfather felt his heart warm. There were still scars, of course. The fear didn't disappear overnight, but there was hope. The girl was playing again, laughing at simple things, allowing herself to be a child. It was a slow but real process. Mr. Johnson knew he was on the right path. The open Bible in her grandfather's living room became part of Emily's routine. Every night they read a verse together, grandfather explained. She asked questions. It was a healing moment, silent but powerful. Emily felt those words were meant for her. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," she repeated. And for the first time, she truly believed it. Sergeant Miller visited from time to time, ensuring everything was under control. Emily enjoyed seeing him because she felt safe. He always had a firm but human tone. He made a point of speaking directly to her, showing respect. This helped her understand that there were trustworthy adults, and this discovery was transformative. Rick, on the other hand, was increasingly isolated. I tried calling, I tried intimidating, but every attempt was recorded as evidence. The protective screen around Emily was solid. She no longer felt vulnerable, as before, and she realized that the truth, even when delayed, always finds a way to prevail. It was a lesson I would carry with me forever. Linda began attending counseling sessions. She talked about her fears, her guilt, her mistakes. She discovered that she, too, needed healing. Emily watched her mother change little by little. It wasn't easy, but it was possible. Their relationship was being rebuilt, brick by brick, and that filled Emily with hope. At school, Emily started playing with her classmates again. At first, she was still shy, but gradually she opened up. Mrs. Carter encouraged her, always with affection. One day, Emily truly smiled in class, and everyone noticed. It was like a ray of sunshine shining through a window. The girl who had previously hidden herself was now beginning to blossom. It was the fruit of truth. Her grandfather closely followed her every step. He never let Emily feel alone. He took her to the park, helped with her homework, and watched cartoons with her. Every simple gesture carried enormous weight. It was as if he were giving her back the childhood that had been stolen. Emily felt gratitude even though she didn't know how to express it. The community continued to support her. Church women brought cakes, neighbors offered rides, even the mailman asked how they were doing. Emily felt part of something bigger. She was no longer the isolated girl, trapped in silence. Now, she was part of a network that cared for her, and this helped her believe in the future. Rick, faced with the accusations, began to lose strength. His veneer of respectable man no longer convinced anyone. Emily heard a neighbor say, "He never inspired me with confidence." For the first time, she didn't feel fear when she heard his name. She felt relief. It was as if the shadow was disappearing, and that gave way to light. Mr. Johnson reflected every night. He knew the fight wasn't over yet, but he felt more confident. He saw Emily smile again and thanked God in prayer. He felt he was fulfilling the promise he'd made to Martha. As long as I breathe, you'll be safe. And now, he could see it happening before his eyes. Emily learned that the truth can be painful, but it's also liberating. She discovered she didn't have to keep everything to herself, that there were adults willing to listen and protect her. This discovery changed her way of seeing the world. She still had scars, but she also had hope, and that made all the difference. Linda, for her part, found support in her church group. Older women shared their own stories of overcoming hardship. She realized she wasn't alone in facing hardships. This gave her the courage to carry on. Emily watched her mother grow stronger, and it strengthened her as well. It was as if they were growing together. The investigation continued, and the truth became increasingly clear. Emily was no longer just a victim. Now she was also a witness to her own life, someone who, even at a young age, had found a voice. This change was visible. Silence was turning into words, and words had power. At the end of the day, Emily looked out her grandfather's window and watched the sunset. The colors painted the sky as if it were a new canvas. She thought about everything that had happened and wondered what would come next. Her heart still bore scars, but it was also full of hope. And she knew the truth would reveal much more. When the news spread, the neighborhood reacted unexpectedly. In Springfield, the quiet streets transformed into a space of care and solidarity. People Emily barely knew began showing up with small gestures. Some brought meals, others offered transportation. It was as if the entire community had awakened. The local church was one of the first to mobilize. The pastor announced a prayer chain for Emily and Linda. Gray-haired women volunteered to cook and sew clothes. The young people in the choir organized visits to play with Emily. She, shy, watched everything with surprised eyes. She had never felt so much affection coming from so many directions. Mrs. Parker, the next-door neighbor, began bringing cakes and pies whenever she could. Emily felt welcomed just by the sweet aroma wafting through the house. Each slice was accompanied by a sincere hug. For a girl who had lived so long in silence, these simple gestures carried enormous weight. It was like a reminder that the world could be kind. The school wasn't far behind either. Mrs. Carter, the teacher, organized a small drive to ensure Emily had everything she needed: a new backpack, school supplies, even extra books for her home library. The entire class contributed something. Emily was speechless, but her smile said it all. It was as if the class had made room for her to blossom again. In the community, everyone had a story to tell. Some older women shared their own difficult experiences. With Linda, they spoke of loss, difficult husbands, and new beginnings. Linda listened, moved, realizing she was not alone. This support network was like a warm blanket on cold nights. Emily, observing, learned the value of sharing. Mr. Johnson was moved to see so much solidarity. He had always believed in the power of community, but now he saw it in action. People he had helped in the past were now giving back. It was living proof that sowing kindness always bears fruit. Emily, beside him, felt proud. It was as if she were discovering the invisible strength of bonds that unite people. The church organized weekly support meetings for women and children. Emily attended shyly, but she heard stories that touched her deeply. She discovered that other children had also faced difficulties. This made her feel less isolated. Gradually, she realized that sharing was a form of healing. Every word exchanged was a seed of hope. At Riverscape Park, community volunteers organized an afternoon of fun for Emily and other children. There were picnics, games, and live music. Emily ran, played, and laughed like she hadn't in a long time. Her grandfather watched from afar with discreet tears in his eyes. Seeing his granddaughter smile again was a gift. It was as if a weight was being lifted little by little. At Sunday school, Emily received a special gift, an illustrated children's Bible. The colorful pages made the stories more vivid. She especially loved the one about Esther, the courageous queen who saved her people. Emily saw herself in her, small but strong, silent but decisive. This identification filled her with courage and planted dreams in her heart. Linda also found a safe space among the women in the church. They prayed together, shared their pains and victories. Some even accompanied her to appointments and important meetings. Linda began to smile more, talk more, and lift her shoulders. Emily noticed this change with joy. Finally, she saw her mother growing stronger, and that inspired her. The pastor organized a collection of clothes and toys for Emily. Children from the community donated dolls, books, and games. Emily was thrilled. unable to believe that all of this was for her. Each object represented more than just material things. It was a gesture of love. For the first time, she felt like she had a place in people's lives. It was as if she had found a bigger family therapist, Dr. Walker, recommended by the school. Also began to work with Emily. Through games and drawings, she helped her express herself. Emily spoke little, but showed a lot in her features. Dr. Walker said that each color she used represented a piece of her voice, and little by little, that voice was beginning to free itself. It was a slow but hopeful process. In the neighborhood, backyard get-togethers became more frequent. They invited Emily and her grandfather to barbecues, simple parties, and card games. She loved the sound of laughter, the smell of food in the air, the sound of country music. These were normal things, but for her, they were extraordinary. She felt included, part of something bigger, and it healed her heart. The church youth created a school support group for Emily. They spent afternoons helping with math, science, and English. But more than studying, it was a time of friendship. Emily laughed, learned new slang, and even began to relax more. It was a breath of life that slowly entered, and each day was another step toward healing. Aunt Sandra increased her visits. She came on weekends, bringing gifts, and most importantly, her presence. Emily felt special with her attention. Rick had never liked Sandra, but now, without him around, her aunt had room to shine. Together, they cooked, laughed, and talked. It was like making up for lost time, and Emily loved it. At school, Emily began to be called upon for leadership roles. She helped distribute materials, organize lines, and participate in presentations. Small roles, but they gave her importance. Mrs. Carter knew exactly what she was doing. She gave Emily the chance to feel capable, and it changed the way she saw herself. It was the beginning of a new identity. The community rallied around the idea of protection. Everyone knew about the situation, but instead of gossip, there was care. Neighbors kept a discreet watch. Teachers communicated. Church leaders offered support. It was as if an invisible net surrounded Emily and Linda. This net provided security and showed that no one needed to face life alone. Emily began writing thank you letters. They weren't long, but they were filled with sincerity. She delivered them to neighbors, teachers, and church friends. Each letter featured colorful drawings and simple phrases like, "Thank you for taking care of me." These letters touched the recipient, and they were also a way for Emily to connect. She learned that gratitude transforms the grandfather. Seeing all this, remembered Martha's words. She always said that a child needs a village to grow. Now, he saw it happening before his eyes. Emily wasn't just being protected, she was being raised by an entire community. This gave him peace, and made him believe that Martha was smiling from heaven in the church kitchen. Emily helped the women prepare community meals. She learned how to peel potatoes, mix ingredients, and set tables. She laughed at the older women's funny stories. She felt valued, like she was part of something worthwhile. This participation boosted her self-esteem and made her more confident every day. In the park, a group of young people organized an afternoon of sports. Emily played volleyball, ran, fell, and got up again. Every move was a victory. She was no longer trapped by fear. She was free to be a child. Her grandfather, watching, silently thanked them. It was like watching a butterfly emerge from its cocoon. Emily was blossoming before everyone. Linda received support in pursuing a technical course. She wanted to study nursing, something she'd always dreamed of but never had the courage to do. The community helped with contacts and enrollment. Emily applauded her mother when she told her. For the first time, she felt her future could be different, and she was moved to see her mother believing in herself. The evenings at her grandfather's house were lighter. They ate dinner together, read the Bible, and told stories. Sometimes neighbors would drop by for coffee and a chat. The living room was always full of life. Emily loved watching the action, hearing the laughter. It was as if the loneliness had disappeared, and in its place there was human warmth. Emily began to dream again. She dreamed of being a teacher or maybe a doctor. She wrote plans in her notebook, something she had never done before. Before, the future had seemed nebulous. Now, it was an open field. She knew there were challenges, but she also knew she was not alone. This changed everything. Her heart beat with hope. The Springfield community demonstrated that love could be practical. It wasn't just words, it was concrete actions. Every gesture, big or small, made a difference. Emily learned that God often answers prayers through people. This discovery transformed her faith and made her believe that there was still much to come. The proud grandfather looked on with gratitude. He saw Emily smile, saw Linda grow stronger, saw the community united. It was like a miracle happening little by little, not with thunder or lightning, but with hugs and outstretched hands. And he knew this was just the beginning. There was still a long road ahead, Emily, lying in bed, thought about everything she had experienced. She couldn't believe so much had changed in such a short time, but at the same time, I felt there were still pages to be written. The past had left its mark, but the future was full of possibilities. And deep down, I knew there was still a decisive chapter to come. The Montgomery County Courthouse was packed that morning. The atmosphere was heavy but also charged with anticipation. Emily held her grandfather's hand tightly as they walked down the hallway. Each step echoed like a sign of change. Her heart was pounding, but there was courage in her eyes. Linda stood beside them, her expression serious but determined. She was no longer the woman bent over by fear. There was a firmness in her expression that surprised even her own daughter. Emily looked at her and realized her mother was changing, and this change gave them both strength. It was as if they were united for the first time in a long time. Rick's defense attorney tried to paint a picture of misunderstanding. He said he was just a strict man, concerned about discipline. But the prosecution presented compelling evidence. Messages, reports from school, observations from neighbors. Every detail showed it wasn't an exaggeration. Emily listened silently, but inside she felt a weight lifting. Judge Henderson, a calm, experienced man, listened attentively. He didn't rush to conclude but asked pointed questions. Emily was impressed by the way he conducted the hearing. He seemed to seek justice patiently, without being carried away by emotions. It was unlike anything she had ever seen, and that instilled confidence in her. The time for testimonies arrived. Mrs. Carter was the first to speak. In a firm voice, she described the changes she had noticed in Emily. She spoke of the drawings, the silence, the absences. Her words filled the room with emotion. Emily felt like crying, but also smiling. Finally, someone was saying in public, "What?" She had been living in silence. Next. Counselor Ms. Green recounted her conversations with Emily. She said the girl was shy, but that her expressions spoke louder than words. She showed the drawing of the house with open doors. The judge observed closely. It was simple yet powerful evidence. Emily shrank in her chair but felt proud of herself. Her voice, even quiet, was being heard. Linda's testimony was the most difficult. She took a deep breath, looked at her daughter, and began to speak. She admitted her fears, her inaction, and the pain she carried. She said she wasn't there to justify herself, but to protect Emily. Tears flowed, but her words were clear. Emily squeezed her hand, showing her understanding. It was a moment of reconciliation. Rick, for his part, tried to maintain a firm stance. He denied the accusations, claiming they were all fabricated. But his nervousness was evident. The judge watched every gesture, every contradiction. The prosecution dismantled his statements with evidence and testimony. Emily could see his mask slipping before everyone's eyes. It was like watching a stage collapse. The most moving moment was when her grandfather was called. Mr. Johnson spoke little, but every word carried weight. He said he had promised to protect his granddaughter, and that he would do so until the last day of his life. His voice was firm without needing to shout. The entire room fell silent, listening. Emily felt enveloped by the strength of that love. It was like an invisible shield around her at the end of the first day. The judge ordered stricter protective measures against Rick. Emily breathed a sigh of relief. It wasn't the final decision, but it was already a victory. Linda hugged her daughter, overcome with emotion. Her grandfather silently thanked God. Hope was taking shape. What had once been just a wish was now beginning to become reality in the courthouse hallway. Women from the community waited for Linda and Emily. They brought hugs, words of support, and even small gifts. Emily was surprised to see so many people. There for her, she wasn't used to being the center of care, but her heart warmed. It was as if each hug was a new layer of protection, and it strengthened her. The following days were filled with court appearances. Each session brought new revelations, new emotions. Emily was no longer so scared. She felt like she was part of something important. It was as if she were writing her own story of victory, and that gave her confidence. Even her dreams became lighter. At school, her classmates knew something was up. Some asked questions, others just watched in silence. Emily didn't share details, but she felt respected. She was no longer the invisible girl. She was someone who faced a battle and won. This realization changed the way she saw herself. It helped her get up every day. The judge ordered a psychological evaluation for Emily. Therapist Dr. Walker was also called to the stand. She spoke about the girl's progress, her resilience, and her faith. She emphasized how, even at a young age, she displayed impressive strength. Emily listened attentively. It was strange to be analyzed, but also comforting. Someone saw beyond her fear. Rick was beginning to lose favor. Some neighbors who had once greeted him now avoided contact. The veneer of a respectable man was slipping. Emily noticed this and felt more secure. The fear was still there, but less. Her grandfather used to say, "The truth always comes out." And now she saw it happening before her own eyes. One day, Emily was called upon to speak briefly. The judge asked if she felt safe with her grandfather. The girl responded with a firm yes. The entire room was moved. It wasn't many words, but they were enough. Emily felt her voice had value, and that changed everything. It was the beginning of a new Emily. Linda remained steadfast. She participated in sessions, answered difficult questions, and met everyone's gaze. Emily watched her with admiration. It was like watching a flower bloom amidst concrete. For the first time, she saw her mother not as a victim, but as a warrior. This change also transformed their relationship. Now they walked side by side. The church organized a special vigil during the most important week of the trial. They sang hymns, read psalms, and prayed for the family. Emily participated, shy but moved. She felt the strength of their united voices. It was as if an invisible wall had been erected around her. And this gave her the courage to face the court the next day. The moment of the final decision was tense. Everyone was silent as the judge read the words. Rick would be held accountable for his actions and would remain permanently removed. Emily held her breath. Linda cried loudly in relief. Mr. Johnson squeezed his granddaughter's hand tightly. It was as if the world had changed in an instant. Justice had been served. But the judge also spoke about starting over. He said Emily and Linda deserved to rebuild their lives with dignity, and he emphasized the importance of the community in providing ongoing support. These words stuck in Emily's heart. It wasn't just a sentence against Rick. It was also a chance for a fresh start, and that filled her with hope. As she left the courthouse, Emily felt the sun on her face. She took a deep breath, as if the air were different. Her grandfather smiled, and Linda hugged her. There were tears, but there were also smiles. It was a mixture of relief and anticipation. Life wouldn't be easy, but it would be free, and that freedom was the greatest gift of all. The community celebrated quietly. There were no fireworks or parties, but there were heartfelt hugs. The church ladies prepared a special dinner. Emily ate with a smile, surrounded by people who loved her. Her grandfather told funny stories, and everyone laughed together. It was as if a shadow had been lifted, and in its place there was light. Emily learned something important in that courtroom. She discovered that her voice, however small, could make a difference. That a grandfather's love, a mother's care, and the community's support could change destinies. This discovery became a part of her. She was no longer just a scared girl. She was a survivor, ready to grow up. And that filled her with pride. That night, lying in her grandfather's bed, Emily thought about everything that had happened. She remembered the witnesses, the tears, the prayers. She also remembered the judge's words about starting over. And she felt this was just the beginning. There was still so much to live for. The future was wide open, full of possibilities. Linda, sitting on the edge of the bed, held her daughter's hand. He said softly, "We're free now, Emily." The girl smiled with tears in her eyes. She knew there were still challenges, but she also knew they were no longer alone. Grandpa came into the room, placed his hand on both of them, and prayed. It was a simple yet powerful moment. It was the symbol of a new beginning. Emily fell asleep with a smile on her face. She dreamed of open fields, wide open doors, and her grandfather walking beside her. The courtroom had been a difficult battle, but also a milestone. She was no longer a hostage to silence. Now she was the master of her own voice, and that changed everything. What no one knew was that this new phase would bring even more discoveries. Life at her grandfather's house began to take on a new rhythm. Mornings were filled with the smell of fresh coffee and the sound of the radio playing oldies. Emily woke up feeling lighter, unburdened by the apprehension she'd previously carried. I no longer needed to measure every word or step. It was as if finally I could breathe without fear. The breakfast table became a place of joy. Pancakes, scrambled eggs, and laughter filled the space. Linda was still getting used to the new routine, but she was already smiling more. Emily watched her mother fondly, noticing the difference in her eyes. It was as if they were both learning to live again. Emily's room was decorated in soft colors. Grandpa painted the walls light blue and hung drawings she had made. Emily loved seeing her creations displayed like works of art. It gave her a sense of worth she'd never felt before. Every detail was a reminder that this space was hers, safe and welcoming. At night, the ritual was different. Instead of heavy silence, there were stories, prayers, and hugs. The grandfather recounted stories from his youth, and Linda shared memories of Emily's childhood. The girl huddled between them, listening intently. He felt part of a continuous line of love. And this healed deep wounds at Riverscape Park. Emily ran freely. The wind blew in her face, and she laughed loudly, unafraid of being reprimanded. Her grandfather watched her proudly, remembering the promises they'd made. Linda walked alongside, taking photos with her cell phone. They were simple but precious memories. Each click was a victory over the past. School also became a lighter place. Emily raised her hand to respond, participated in activities, and laughed with her classmates. Mrs. Carter noticed the difference and was moved. She saw before her not just a student, but a story of overcoming adversity. Emily discovered she could learn and have fun at the same time. The weight of silence began to lift. At home, Linda and Emily created new rituals. They watched old shows together, popped popcorn, and laughed at silly jokes. Small moments, but they filled their hearts. Emily began to trust her mother more, realizing that she, too, was in the process of healing. It was a journey together, and each step was a victory. Her attentive grandfather encouraged his granddaughter to keep a diary. He said words have the power to liberate. Emily started out shy with short sentences, but soon she was filling pages with thoughts, dreams, and even drawings. This diary became her secret space of expression. It was like speaking to her own heart, and it helped her understand herself better. In the kitchen, Emily loved helping. She peeled potatoes, mixed ingredients, and learned old family recipes. Linda and her grandfather reveled in her successes and failures. The smell of baking bread filled the house with warmth. Cooking became therapy, and every meal was a reminder that they were together. Prayer nights with her grandfather became sacred. They read psalms and discussed their meaning. Emily especially loved Psalm 23, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will not fear. Now she understood those words differently. She felt like she had already walked through a valley, and she was on the other side, alive and stronger. The community remained present. The church ladies brought flowers, sweets, and even hand-sewn clothes. Emily felt loved in every detail. It was as if she had an extended family. Her grandfather would say, "God cares for orphans and widows, and for us too." Emily smiled when she heard this. She felt part of something bigger. Linda began studying nursing. It was a challenge, but she dedicated herself wholeheartedly. Emily watched her with pride. She liked seeing her with books and notebooks focused. She was an example of starting over. She showed that it's never too late to change your life. This lesson was deeply engraved in the girl's heart. The days became more colorful. Emily painted pictures, tended plants, and wrote short stories. Grandpa encouraged her to share her creations. Linda read aloud, filled with emotion. The girl felt valued. He was no longer the invisible child. Now he was someone with a voice, talent, and a future. Her grandfather took her to visit the lake, where they used to fish. Emily was delighted to return. They cast their lines into the water and laughed when the fish escaped. They sat on the shore in silence, just gazing at the horizon. It was a simple moment, yet full of meaning. Emily felt peace in her heart, and she was grateful to be there at home. They created a memory wall. Photos, drawings, inspirational quotes. Emily loved posting new images every week. It was like seeing her life being reconstructed in color. The wall became a silent testament to change. Every time she looked at it, she was reminded that she was in a new chapter, and that kept her motivated. The fear didn't completely disappear. There were nights when Emily had nightmares, but now, when she woke up scared, she ran to her grandfather's room. He hugged her, prayed with her, and waited until she fell asleep again. This constant presence gave her security. It was proof that she didn't have to face this alone, and that made all the difference. Linda also had moments of fragility. She cried, remembering the past, feeling guilty for her choices. But now, she shared those feelings. Emily hugged her, saying, "It's okay, Mommy." This mutual support strengthened them both. They discovered that healing came in pairs, and this brought them closer than ever. The community organized a picnic in Emily's honor. Colorful balloons, tables laden with food, and lively music. The girl was overwhelmed by so much affection. She felt celebrated and valued. Her grandfather wept quietly, proudly. It was as if everyone was saying, "You won." And this recognition nourished her soul. At Bible school, Emily was asked to read a verse aloud. At first, her voice trembled, but it soon steadied. Everyone applauded, and she smiled with tears in her eyes. It was like winning an invisible battle. She discovered she could speak in front of others, and that her voice had value. It was a milestone in her journey. Her grandfather's house was filled with life. Neighbors passed by, friends came for coffee, family called frequently. Emily loved the movement. She felt part of a network of love. There was no longer room for the heavy silence of the past. Now there was laughter, conversation, and plans. And this healed her day by day. Emily began writing letters to the future. She wrote to herself at 18, 25, even 40. She spoke of dreams, fears, and advice. She kept everything in a special box. This habit made her think beyond the present. It was like planting seeds in fertile soil, and it made her believe in tomorrow. Linda, in her nursing classes, shared parts of her story. She inspired other women who also wanted to start over. Emily listened and was filled with pride. Her mother was becoming a role model. She was no longer just a survivor, but also an inspiration. This transformation was a gift for both of them. Her grandfather encouraged Emily to believe in her talents. He told her she had a creative mind and a generous heart. The girl was thrilled with every compliment. She felt she could dream big, and those dreams became increasingly clear. They weren't just fantasies, they were achievable goals, and that motivated her to keep going. Sunday nights were special. They gathered on the porch, with chamomile tea and old stories. Grandfather talked about his youth, Linda reminisced about her childhood, and Emily asked curious questions. It was a circle of generations, united by love. These nights became a tradition, and Emily knew she would treasure every detail forever. Emily's heart was being rebuilt. It was no longer just a place of fear, but of hope. Every gesture of affection, every word of encouragement was like new brick in an old house. The rebuilding was slow but steady, and she realized she wasn't alone. This changed everything. Her grandfather always reminded her, healing isn't forgetting, it's learning to live differently. Emily reflected on this, especially on silent nights. She understood that the scars would be a part of her. But she also understood that they were signs of victory. Each mark was proof of survival, and that made her even stronger. Linda, more confident, began to plan for the future. She talked about moving house, about building a new life. Emily listened. Enthusiastically, she felt that tomorrow was no longer a threat, but a promise. It was like looking down a long road and seeing the horizon illuminated, and this filled her heart with courage. Mornings that once began with fear now began with hope. Emily woke thinking about what she would learn, what she would create, what she would experience. The past still hurt, but it no longer defined everything. Now, there was room for the new, and that space was expanding day by day. On the last night of that summer, Grandfather gathered everyone on the porch. They prayed together, giving thanks for each victory and asking for strength for the future. Emily closed her eyes, feeling the gentle breeze. She thought about everything she had experienced, and she realized her heart was no longer a prisoner. It was being reformed, open to tomorrow. Time passed and life at her grandfather's house transformed into a loving home. Emily no longer walked with fear, but with confidence. Her eyes reflected the light of a restored childhood. Linda also flourished, studying and rebuilding her life. Her grandfather watched with silent pride. Mr. Johnson felt he was keeping his promise. He was protecting Emily as he had sworn on the day of Martha's funeral. But he also sensed something bigger happening. His granddaughter wasn't just surviving, she was growing up, discovering who she was, and that was more than he could have dreamed. Each morning her grandfather repeated his routine of coffee and prayer. Emily had grown accustomed to joining him, opening the Bible together. These readings became a living legacy. They weren't just words, but seeds planted in her heart, seeds that would grow throughout her life. Linda, growing stronger, made plans for the future. She talked about moving house, perhaps to a nearby town, starting over. Emily listened with hope. She liked the idea of a home of their own, but she also knew her grandfather would always be there. He was the root that would never be uprooted, and that comforted her. The letters Emily wrote to her future self accumulated in a special box. One day, she showed one to her grandfather. It read, "I want to be someone who helps others as you helped me." Mr. Johnson read it silently, moved. He saw in it a reflection of his life. The legacy was already planted in her heart. At school, Emily began helping classmates who were struggling. She sat beside them, explained homework, and lent them notebooks. Mrs. Carter watched with affection. She saw that the girl was transforming her pain into empathy, and this was a sign of maturity rare for her age. Emily was becoming a beacon of light. Her grandfather realized his granddaughter had special gifts: creativity, sensitivity, courage. He encouraged her to dream big. Emily talked about being a teacher, a doctor, or even a writer. He smiled, saying the world was too big to limit choices. The important thing was to maintain faith and courage, and she already had plenty of those in the community. Emily was seen as an inspiration. Children wanted to play with her, women hugged her, men greeted her. She didn't understand why she made such an impact, but her grandfather knew. People recognized her strength of resilience, and that glow was impossible to hide. It was like a flame that illuminated others. Linda, with her journey of starting over, also became an example. The women at church saw in her proof that it's always possible to rise again. Emily admired her mother more and more. She was proud to see her studying, dreaming, and rebuilding herself. The two formed a strong duo. and this united their hearts even more. Grandfather always remembered Martha's saying, "Our family is our heritage." Now he saw it come true in an unexpected way. Emily and Linda were rebuilding their lives, but they carried within them the strength of the past. This connection between generations was their true legacy, stronger than any hardship. One afternoon, Emily found an old box of letters from her grandmother. She read some aloud to her grandfather and Linda. The words were full of love and faith. Emily felt as if Martha were still there, guiding her steps. Her grandfather wept quietly, holding his granddaughter's hand. It was a reminder that love never dies. In the backyard, the oak tree planted by Mr. Johnson stood tall. Emily loved playing in its shade. One day, her grandfather said, "This tree represents you. Strong, rooted, growing toward the sky." The girl smiled, hugging the trunk. She understood that she too was part of something greater. It was a living legacy, rooted in love. Sunday nights continued to be special. Hot tea, stories, and laughter filled the room. Emily was no longer afraid of the dark. She knew she was surrounded by love. These traditions became her greatest treasure, and she promised herself she would carry forward everything she was learning. The legacy would live on. Her grandfather encouraged Emily to write about her own life. He said stories have the power to heal. She started shyly but soon filled pages. With memories and dreams, Linda Reed moved and her grandfather smiled proudly. The girl discovered she could transform pain into words, and that her words could transform other lives. At Bible school, Emily was invited to speak to other children. She explained simply that God always listens, even in silence. Her voice trembled, but her words touched hearts. The other children applauded her, and Emily felt something new. She was making a real impact. It was the beginning of a greater calling. Seeing all this, the grandfather thanked God in prayer. He knew he wouldn't live forever, but he felt at peace. His legacy was already firmly established in his granddaughter's heart. Emily would forever carry the lessons of courage, faith, and love, and this thought comforted him. His mission was being accomplished. Linda also recognized the importance of her father in their lives. She hugged him often, thanking him for never giving up on them. Emily observed these displays of affection. She felt proud to be part of that story. She knew that love was the root of everything, and that strengthened her to move forward. The future was still uncertain, but now Emily didn't see it as a threat. She saw it as a promise. Each day was a blank page, ready to be written. The past had left scars, but also lessons, and she chose to look forward. With faith, courage, and hope, in the community, Emily began to be invited to give short speeches at local events. She spoke about gratitude, about never losing faith, about the importance of asking for help. Her voice was gentle yet powerful. It touched the hearts of adults and children alike. Her grandfather applauded, moved. He knew she was just getting started. Emily wrote an open letter to other girls suffering in silence. It said, "You are not alone. There is always someone willing to help. Don't be afraid to speak up." This letter circulated through church and school. It touched many people, and it showed that her voice had a real impact. It was the beginning of a larger movement. Linda, watching her daughter, felt gratitude. She saw in her the hope so many women needed. She felt that together they had won a battle, but that there was still much to be done. Emily inspired her, and she inspired Emily. It was a cycle of love, and it strengthened them daily. Her grandfather always said, "Legacy isn't what we leave, it's what we plant." Emily kept that phrase close to her heart. She wanted to plant kindness, courage, and faith wherever she went. She knew she didn't need to be perfect. She just needed to be true. That was the essence of what she had learned, and it was what she would carry into the future one day. Emily asked her grandfather, "What will happen when you're no longer here?" He smiled, held her hand, and replied, "I will always be in you, in the things you do, in the choices you make." "That is the legacy," the girl cried, but also smiled. She understood that love doesn't die. It multiplies. Time passed, and Emily began planning for the next summer. She wanted to write a children's memoir inspired by her life. Her grandfather supported her, as did Linda. The community was already eagerly awaiting her stories. Emily didn't know if she could finish it, but she was certain of one thing: she had to try. Her legacy was already under construction. Nights on the porch remained a refuge. Emily, her grandfather, and her mother would gaze at the starry sky, talking about dreams. They would laugh, cry, and give thanks together. These nights became symbols of unity. Emily knew she would never forget them. She would treasure them forever and pass them on. The grandfather looked at his granddaughter and saw in her the answer to all his prayers. Emily was no longer the frightened girl. She was a young woman with strength, a voice, and hope. He smiled, knowing the future was secure. The legacy was alive, and it would continue to grow. Emily, lying in bed, thought about tomorrow. She knew the road was long, but she wasn't afraid. She had faith, she had family, she had community, and that was enough. She closed her eyes, dreaming of open doors and broad horizons, and she felt in her heart the best was yet to come. Dear friend, after everything Emily has been through, you might be wondering, what can I learn from this story? Life shows us that even in the darkest situations, there is always a way out. Sometimes it comes through faith, sometimes through the courage of someone who loves us, and often through the community that rises up around us. Have you ever felt trapped in a silence that no one seemed to notice? Have you ever carried pain you didn't have the courage to share? Emily's story is a reminder that we never have to walk alone. God always sends someone, a friend, a neighbor, a family member, even a stranger, to answer our prayers. What touches me most is realizing how small actions can change destinies. A phone call, a prayer, a hug. All of these can be the beginning of a transformation. So I ask you, what would you do if you saw someone suffering in silence? Would you reach out or pass them by? Emily shows us that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward even when trembling inside, and her grandfather teaches us that promises made with true love become unbreakable walls. Now think about yourself. What promises would you like to leave as a legacy for your family? If this story touched your heart, I want to invite you to reflect. What would you do if you were in Emily's shoes? And more, what would you do if you were called to be someone's grandfather, the person who extends protection and hope? These questions are seeds for you to think about today and carry in your heart. And of course, if you want to continue hearing inspiring stories like this, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. That way you won't miss any of the upcoming episodes, which will touch your soul and bring you precious lessons. I promise each one will be made for you,